Spirit, draw near. It's hard to imagine a worse year than 2020. And things did not miraculously get better with the new year either, did they? Just days ago, we witnessed an insurrection at our nation's capital at the behest of our president. We are on the edge wondering what comes next. In the words of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. And so we keep on keeping on. We find glimmers of hope here and there. We know that when we gather as Unitarian Universalists, as a faith community, we become something more than each of our individual selves. Our sum is greater than the whole of our parts. That something that is created when we come together has power. It carries with it a real power to transform the world. Now, I know this sounds lofty and perhaps even a bit, idealistic. And yet, when has a movement changed the course of events that wasn't lofty and idealistic? I was brought up in the idealism of an intentional community during the 1970s. My parents and their friends and a few relatives chose to live off the grids in the woods of northwestern Pennsylvania. They were an idealistic group, inspired by Ina May and Stephen Gaskin and their intentional community called The Farm in Tennessee. We too were seeking an alternative to materialism, the crushing pressures of society, the exceptionalism, and the progress narrative of our dominant culture. The culture war was raging. We were reeling from the assassinations of MLK and RFK and the horrors of the Vietnam War, the police violence at Kent State, the ongoing violence against anyone who didn't fit the mold of proper white society. The Farm seemed to have created this kind of alternative intentional living community, and we looked to them for inspiration. And so it is that we look for the people, the groups, the visionaries who are idealistic and unreasonably hopeful in the midst of truly terrible situations. Those who bring gorgeous art and music to our world when we most need it. Spiritual leaders who are able to guide us. One such delightful human being is His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet. When he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in 1989, he delivered a beautiful speech. Now, I did not hear or read his speech at the time. I was a junior in high school, and I was only dimly aware of the situation in Tibet. The Free Tibet movement really became widely popular in the United States and Europe after the Beastie Boys, yes, the Beastie Boys, used samples of Tibetan monks on an album in 1994. The group then invited these monks to join them on stage during a live performance at Lollapalooza, which in turn inspired a Live Aid type series of high profile concerts to raise money for the movement. The Free Tibet movement was further popularized through a very savvy merchandising campaign. And at one point, it seemed like everyone I knew had one of those ubiquitous Free Tibet stickers or t-shirts. I too had one of these Free Tibet stickers on the bumper of my 1986 Toyota Corolla. Here we are, 31 years later. And thanks to a seminary assignment in my Introduction to Buddhism class, I had the opportunity to read the text of the Dalai Lama's Nobel acceptance speech. It is an inspired vision for a peaceful world. One might even say it is idealistic. And I believe it is a vision of gathering and living with intention shared by many of us as Unitarian Universalists. The Dalai Lama outlines what he refers to as zones of ahimsa, peace sanctuaries. Ahimsa is a term for nonviolence. The Dalai Lama's vision is that the entire Tibetan plateau should become a free refuge where humanity and nature can live in peace and harmonious balance. It would be a refuge for people from all over the globe to escape the pressures and anxieties of the rest of the world and seek the true meaning of peace within themselves. And what a better place for such an idealistic vision. The Tibetan Plateau is the roof of the world. It contains the source waters that spread out across the continent. These headwaters feed the Mekong, the Yangtze, and the Indus rivers, just to name a few. So what would this gathered community living an intentionally spiritual life on the Tibetan Plateau be like? Some key elements of the Dalai Lama's peace sanctuary are the entire country would be demilitarized. The area would be transformed into the world's largest biosphere. Strict laws would be enforced to protect wildlife and plant life. The exploitation of natural resources would be carefully regulated so as to not destroy any ecosystems. National resources and policy would be directed toward the active promotion of peace and environmental protection. Of course, this all sounds great to me. I would say in large part due to the fact that I was raised a Unitarian Universalist by hippies in the woods. It's not surprising that I would be attracted to this sort of idealistic vision of sustainability and peace. Now, we didn't have electricity and running water when I was growing up, which is pretty extreme. And the Dalai Lama doesn't go that far. Rather, he makes a compelling case for the need to strategically adopt the use of modern technology when he states material progress is, of course, important for human advancement. In Tibet, he says, we paid too little attention to technological and economical development, and today we realize this was a mistake. What he says next opens a window into his spiritual vision. He proposes a very Buddhist concept of a middle way between only material development on one hand and only spiritual development on the other hand. This is following the example of the Buddha, who found a middle way between the extravagant material opulence of his childhood and the extreme asceticism of the sadhu life, the life of a holy man, living off of only a few grains of rice each day. So a middle way. When we gather as Unitarian Universalists in our spiritual communities, we have an opportunity to create our very own zones of ahimsa, our very own peace sanctuaries, our own middle way between full participation in a system that is bent on crushing us on the one hand, and a complete retreat from society altogether on the other. When we gather, may we create a temporary, alternative world. This is a concept introduced by author Priya Parker and one you will hear more about from Carrie in a few minutes. When we gather as a community of faith, we become something more than each of our individual selves. Our sum is greater than the whole of our parts. That something that is created when we come together carries with it a transformational power. May our spiritual community be intentional living, a refuge of peace and spiritual growth where we can escape the materialism, the urgency, the exceptionalism, and the individualism of our dominant culture. May we cultivate our spiritual lives. And may our spiritual peace sanctuaries be like drops in a still lake, creating ripples out into the vastness. And may they meet up with the ripples of other beloved communities over and over and over again. And who knows, perhaps we really can transform the world. Is this an idealistic vision? Sure it is. And may it be so.
Wow, what a powerful message, Meagan. Thank you. 12 years ago, my late husband, William, and I bought a house in Connecticut. A few months after we settled into our house, William called me over to his computer. Up on his screen was the website for the Unitarian Church in Westport. He pointed to the screen and said, "Carrie, I think we should go here on Sunday." I saw that word church, and my immediate gut reaction was to say, no way. Both of us came from a Catholic background, William nominally so, while I had gone to Catholic school from kindergarten through high school. In college, I became vehemently anti-religion. William assured me that the Unitarian Church was not like the church I had gone to as a kid. I knew little about Unitarian Universalism, but a couple of William's good friends were UU, and I was starting to get to know them, and they seemed okay. We wanted to connect to a community now that both of us were living in a new state. So I got past that initial gut reaction and agreed to go to the church the following Sunday. And wow, we went seeking community, but I must confess at the time I had a very limited idea of what that meant. What we found in this Unitarian Universalist community was support, healing, and purpose. What we found was the knowledge that what we did mattered not only to ourselves, but to others. What we found was a place where we could practice being in a world we both believed in. One of my favorite things about Unitarian Universalism is how different one congregation can be from another. All congregations are linked by our common Unitarian Universalist principles, and yet each congregation has its own history, sets its own priorities, and lives the Unitarian Universalist principles in different ways out in the world. In the short time I have been with you here at Community Church of New York, I have learned how this congregation's rich history has affected who we are as a UU community today. In this time of global pandemic, when gathering together has become more difficult than we ever could have imagined, we've been forced to reassess why we gather. What is most important about gathering? And how can we best connect with each other? I find it interesting that in one of my seminary classes this last semester, we were assigned Priya Parker's book, The Art of Gathering. The book was written before the global pandemic, so it was really hard to read about the simple or elaborate physical gatherings that were described in the book, gatherings that are impossible today. And yet, reading this book during this time, when building community in new ways is becoming increasingly important, it seems that this is the right time to be reading this book and thinking about these things. Ms. Parker writes that the first step in any gathering is the intentional decision about why you're gathering in the first place. I think UU congregations do this really well, at least at the macro level. It's written into the mission and lives in how they interpret their mission in tangible ways. It is at the very root of why UU congregations have their own histories and differences in how they live out their values. This congregation connects to the mission every week by reading the unison affirmation. Every week we pledge the allegiance of our hands and hearts, among other things, to abjure all that separates and divides, to seek truth in freedom and justice in love, and to make of all persons one beloved community. This is why we gather together as Community Church of New York. And this mission drives everything we do as a community, both within our community and out in the broader world. In 1919, this congregation faced one of its many crossroads. Seeing a world where people of many faiths, many cultures, and many races could worship together, Reverend John Haynes Holmes presented the congregation with a choice: to change their name from Church of the Messiah to the Community Church of New York, and by doing so, join the community church movement. The decision to become a community church was not an easy one. The process was contentious and likely strained many relationships within the congregation. And yet, the vision was accepted, the mission was stated, and the commitment was made. The congregation changed its focus from being tied to a particular Christian denomination to including other denominations as well as faiths beyond Christianity. For over 100 years, the leadership of this church has been working to make of all persons one beloved community. And this congregation has been committed to creating a multiracial, multi-faith, and multicultural community. Because of the continuing commitment of this congregation, Community Church of New York remains one of the most successful multiracial congregations in the Unitarian Universalist Association. And despite points in the history of this congregation where this commitment has caused conflict with other denominations, other congregations, and even within this community itself, at each point of difficulty, this community remembers why they gather and recommits to the mission of this congregation. Back to the book, The Art of Gathering, Ms. Parker writes that one of the signs of a successful gathering is when it creates a temporary alternative world. In an interview, Ms. Parker likens this alternative world to the concept of the magic circle used in virtual game design. The magic circle is defined as a space in which the normal rules and reality of the world are suspended and replaced by the artificial reality of a game world. Setting guidelines on how gatherers act within that gathering is key to creating that temporary alternative world or magic circle. The thing about magic circles that applies to congregations is that while the rules create a kind of shield separating the alternative world from the real world, the boundaries are really quite porous. Participants bring in assumptions from the outside world, play with the assumptions within the alternate world, and then behavior is often transformed and brought back into the real world. This magic circle concept sounds a lot like the middle way from Buddhism or the zones of ahimsa that Meagan talked about earlier. Different cultures have different ways of communicating, expressing disagreement, managing conflict, and making decisions. When there are people from different cultures trying to make decisions together, it's crucial to have guidelines on how to be in community. In building guidelines that we agree to, we decide explicitly and intentionally how we will work together in our alternative world, rather than relying on unsaid, implicit sets of rules, usually those set by the dominant culture. In our congregations, the guidelines for creating our temporary alternative worlds are specified in our covenants with each other. Rather than agreeing on a creed or theology, we are bound together as Unitarian Universalists by our covenant. The guidelines for how we act within our communities, methods for holding each other accountable, and paths for coming back into community when we make mistakes. Like the magic circle or the Buddhist middle way, our congregations are not completely separate from the outside world. We bring in our assumptions and conditioning from the outside world, and within our temporary alternative world, we practice new ways of being with each other within the guidelines of our covenant, forged by our Unitarian Universalist principles. Our behavior is transformed, and we bring these new behaviors out into the real world. In our UU spaces, we practice living the values we want to see in the real world, and by doing so, work to transform the wounded world, one loving action at a time. Just like the congregants of Community Church did over a century ago, this congregation is facing a decision that will affect the future of Community Church. At the end of this month, members will vote whether to sell Community Church's buildings and create a new spiritual home. This decision calls us to cast a collective vision that is beyond any of our individual preferences or desires. Indeed, this decision is beyond the preferences or desires of anyone who is currently in this room today. We are casting a collective vision that will create a middle way for generations to come. This decision must be grounded in why we as Community Church gather in the first place. Because we pledge to make of all persons one beloved community unto all its members known and unknown throughout the world. In this place, we practice creating a world we want to see beyond these walls, whether the walls are brick, virtual, or glass and steel. In this place, we are bound together in covenant as we honor our differences, realizing that we may fall short of our ideals, and learn how to call each other back into community, always working toward our collective mission. Just a few days ago, we witnessed our American democracy being threatened by people who think there should be no diversity in this country. Many of us were scared, angered, saddened by these events. Anxiety is at an all-time high. All of these feelings cannot easily be swept aside and will continue to be felt deeply. And yet, there is still hope. How do I know? I know this because you are all here today, listening to my message, listening to Meagan's message, all helping to create this temporary alternative world we call the Community Church of New York. This world does not require walls. Our space is created by our covenant with each other, by our agreement to be vulnerable with each other, to share our true selves and our beliefs, to work together to solve tricky problems, to hold each other accountable to our better selves and call each other back into community when we fall short. Within this space, word by word, action by action, we create a more inclusive, more compassionate, more sustainable world together. May it be so.